Hello, everyone. Last Sunday, during our Dharma gathering, we had some issues with Zoom and we had to use a different platform. And because of using a different platform, we weren't able to record our Dharma talk. So I wanted to make sure that I re recorded it so that it would be available to the community. So the Dharma talk is titled The Story of the Two Arrows. And I want to start off with a parable of sorts. It's one of the things that the Buddha did in teaching his followers. And the two arrows is a great a parable story about how to deal with suffering. The two arrow story starts in the Salatha Sutta in the Pali Canon. I want to quote from that quote. Suppose that you are walking through a forest. Off in the woods there was an archer who shoots his arrow at you and it hits you in the side. Do you feel pain from this first arrow? Yes, you do. You stumble and lean against a tree in pain. But the archer is not done with you. You hear him in the distance. You hear the string bow tightening. Can you avoid this second arrow seeking you? End quote. So, since this is a parable, the arrow is representing something else. Now, the Buddha awakened 2,500 years ago and then taught for 50 years, and his teachings were all around one general theme, and that was liberation and freedom. Freedom from reactivity, fear, and suffering, which I think is an important lesson right now. It is said that when he woke up under the Bodhi tree, he woke up to the reality of the world as it is. And one of the first things that the Buddha woke up to is that life is filled with dukkha, disappointment, and dissatisfaction, and dis-ease. Now, for some, this may sound rather pessimistic, rather negative, but the Buddha was not a negative kind of guy at all. I like to think of the Buddha as a sort of superhero. And if he was a superhero, his name would be Obvious Man. And he would be called that because his superhero power would be stating the obvious that everybody else wants to ignore. For us to get out of a hole, for us to see out of the darkness, we first need to acknowledge the hole we are in and how dark it is. At the same time, the Buddha was teaching, as one Zen Buddhist teacher, Seijaku Roshi, puts it, life is disappointing, but we don't have to be disappointed by life. End quote. I love that line, and I go back to it quite often. So now you might be wondering about the second arrow. And what does this stuff have to do? So it's a good question. So first of all, the first arrow represents the pain, discomfort that is a part of being human, a part of being alive. We will gain and lose. We will grab after something, and we will have the suffering of aversion where we don't want to be somewhere or with something or someone. A lot of these manifest themselves in a breakup, a divorce, losing a job, losing a place to live, chronic illness, a pandemic out of the blue that requires sacrifice and disconnection and some loneliness because of that. The first arrow is the pain of being human in the world. The first arrow is, for the most part, unavoidable. You will get sick. Economies will fail, and you will lose your job, or somebody you know and depend on will. You may lose everything in the blink of an eye because of a fire, a hurricane, an earthquake, a car accident, a cheating spouse, or a suicidal friend. Everything can change on a Wednesday or a Thursday, in the morning or in the evening. This we all know about life, although we tend to ignore it or push it down. In the noble words of the Buddha, it is as it is. And you probably didn't know that the Buddha said that. It's a translation. It is as it is. And a lot of times we just throw this off as it is what it is, but it's not something we throw off. It's actually an affirmation of life. It is as it is. The pain and suffering is not necessarily, though, this pain and suffering is not necessarily dukkha itself. The Buddha was talking about dukkha being the thing that happens just before or after. Let me rephrase that. Is the thing that happens after the first arrow strikes. The second arrow is what happens. It's that the thump and then our reaction to the arrow being into the soft parts of our body or our heart or our mind. Okay? So the second arrow. The first arrow is inevitability of human suffering, the things that are out of our control that happen to us, like earthquakes, floods, and pandemics. It's also not just big things, it's the daily little things that we have no control over. But we think we do. In our delusion, we think we have control over. And what thing do you think that we have control over? And that would be other people. They will do and hurt us. They will disappoint us. And they have nothing to do with anything we do, ultimately. We can't control other people. We barely have enough willpower to follow the things we really, truly want to do. When I was young, somewhere I got the idea that if I loved someone just right, if I was faithful and kind, they would be too. As if my behavior would bind them to my behavior. Life doesn't work that way. And no matter how much I wanted to and tried to make that reality, it didn't work out very well. So what is the second arrow? The first arrow is the cause. The first arrow is that which is unavoidable, and the second arrow is the arrow we can avoid. It's the arrow of dukkha. The second arrow of disappointment and suffering, of ignorance. What is it? It is our ongoing futile argument with reality. Our refusal to accept things as they are in the moment. It is the tyranny of our, it should be this way, it should be that way, I should be this way, they should be that way. And our constant chanting of, but it's not fair. This is not fair. That's not fair. Which I find so curious that we chant this so much. And yet the first thing we teach our children or are taught as children is who said life was fair? And yet we're constantly saying, this is not fair. This is not right. Why me? The crazy thing about the second arrow, though, is that the archer is not someone else. With the second arrow, we are the archer. We are the one who is taking the arrow and jabbing it into our soft parts. And I think in some ways, it's even more painful than the first arrow. The Buddha taught that we can't always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first arrow. The second arrow is optional. Our first response is pain. It's to feel it. The second part is feeling the pain and then telling the story about the pain. Here is the beginning of suffering. So let me share an episode with you. Some years ago, I was madly in love with a woman, and it was a very tempestuous and passionate love affair. And I climbed on top of a mountain to cry out poetry and my devotion for her. And before I came back down from the peak of the mountain back into the valley floor, she was gone. And it hurt. It hurt deeply. And it was as if all the other disappointments, all the other fears, all the other pains, and the anxiety of feeling unlovable came crashing back. To prove it true, something was wrong with me. It was hard. I felt that somehow I was unworthy, I was broken. I remember walking from the bus stop and walking to work the day after it broke up, and how each step felt so heavy, and it was taking willpower to walk to work. And I remember that my walk took me past some big trees, some big cottonwood trees. And there was a field, an open field, a beautiful open field that looked out over the Ochre Mountains. And through the ache of tears, I noticed a V of geese flying above, overhead. And it was beautiful. They're flying back. It was spring. They're flying back from wherever it is that they go during the winter. And there was a ribbon of wispy clouds draped over the largest of the Ochre Mountains. And it was at that moment that I had one of those aha moments. And it was in this space, in this experience, that I learned in a visceral way how suffering is optional. That understanding that I avoided for years, almost a purposeful ignorance. Maybe it's because I came from a family of professional sufferers. When I was a child, my mom put under my pillow The Lives of the Martyrs, a great Catholic tome, if you've never read it. I think as a family, in some ways, we were blinded at seeing the way out. Maybe that's what is meant by familial karma. As I was looking at the fallen leaves at my feet, I remember just the day before how I was overcome by the beauty of where we live. Looking east, I was imagining Lake Bonneville and how this place I was walking was once underwater, and how that lake helped shape this valley. Just the day before, I was helping worms that had come up out of the grass after a good hard rain and had gone onto the sidewalk, and I was picking them off the concrete and putting them back on the grass. The people at work thought I was nuts. Why would anybody want to do that? But I was just in love with life. I was in love with living. Then a day later, I am heartbroken and wallowing in my suffering. And it was bad. It wasn't a general breakup sadness. This was a heavy sadness, a compounded sadness and a despair. As I was watching the geese honking across the sky, telling everyone that they were coming home, I realized that the only thing that had changed was an idea of how it is supposed to be. The trees, the birds, the mountain about to get married to the sky was still there. Were still giving me gifts. Me and the worms, we were tight. Nothing had changed. Only the story in my head had changed. The tyranny of my expectations of how reality was supposed to be. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I had this aha moment and all of a sudden everything was okay. But I realized at that moment, at least in a deeper sense than ever before, that the suffering in my life was the stories that I wove. And I was the archer stabbing myself with the second arrow. Now, here's the thing about, excuse me, aha moments. I started to get that the second arrow was what it was, but that didn't mean I stopped telling stories or arguing with reality. Sometimes that's the hard part. Habitual ways of being are hard to break, especially habitual ways of thinking. I continued for some time. I felt broken, unlovable, thinking that there was still something inherently wrong with me and I was unfixable. These feelings still arose even after my aha moment. But it helped me realize that I had a second home of suffering. That here with the trees and the worms and the mountains and the geese, that was my true home. But I had a second home, and my second home was suffering. But the nice thing is, because of my aha moment, it was not just a second home, it was simply a timeshare. And what happens a lot of times with timeshares is you begin to look around and you realize this is not the place for you and this is not a good deal. But sometimes our stories keep us suffering longer than we even want. Maybe on a certain level, we want to suffer. We get used to it. We get used to our second home, the home of suffering, because in a weird sort of way, it helps us know that we're alive, but we're alive in a prison of our own making. I think sometimes when we're not suffering and we're so used to suffering that sometimes I think when we're suffering and so used to suffering, we become nostalgic because of the story we tell about suffering has become such a part of our identity. When we cease to suffer, who are we? I am, or I suffer, therefore I am. So, and I want to give you an example. And it's along with the same story too. So, shortly after the breakup happened, I was sitting in a movie theater, and the opening credits were starting to run, and I felt this lightness of mood, like everything would be okay. I was feeling free. And I really think it's because my aha moment was starting to germinate and the seeds were starting to bring forth fruit. And I'm sitting there and I'm feeling this and I'm feeling this, this, this okayness, this groundedness, that everything was okay. Everything would be okay. And it was amazing. I was pulling that second arrow from my side and laying it down. And what do you think my response was as I pulled out that second arrow? I panicked. I panicked as if somehow if I got over this experience so easily, then it must not have been real. And to prove the reality of my passion for this woman, I needed to suffer. My suffering was proof of my devotion and the depth and the reality of my love. That day, I turned away from lightness, from being okay with things as they were, and I put on the wet wool coat of my love. I bought a shipping container full of arrows and dove headfirst into despair. I tried to win her back. I wrote shitty love poems, self-indulgent. I even tried my hand at really bad blues songs. I'm just grateful that this time in Despair City was only a timeshare. It took a long time to come back to the realization of that aha moment. to find my way back to that unburdening and lightness of being. I am not, I'm not, I'm not great at my practice sometimes, but my practice helps me not get carried away in the stories I tell about my pain. Most of the time, I can be aware at least that I am the one putting the arrow in and look at ways to understand myself better. And sometimes it gives me insight onto that part of me that needs attending to. The important thing is it's okay. There's no need to panic. We can take our understanding, we can take the courage from the teachings of the Buddha that pain is inevitable, but that suffering is optional. We can all put down that second arrow. I had put down the second arrow, and I was sitting in that movie theater, and there was something unfamiliar. That feeling of freedom scared me. Don't be afraid to put down that second arrow. Accepting the reality of the situation is liberating, is transcendent. As Gyome Kabose Sensei teaches, acceptance is transcendence. Acceptance is the way to freedom. So we can put down the second arrow. The first thing we need to do is allow ourselves to feel hurt. With a need to tell a story about it, we have a tendency to try to fix it. We're not allowing it to just be what it is. When you're sad, be sad. When you're anxious, be anxious. When you're afraid, be afraid. We need to feel the emotion, but not become the emotion. There's an old saying that says, just because you fall in the river doesn't mean you need to drown in the river. Just because we feel our emotions doesn't mean we need to drown in them. We simply honor it. We do not try to fix it. We do not try to make it go away with elaborate stories of why we feel the pain or whose fault it is, or memorialize it, somehow showing how courageous we are, our red badge of courage. Put it down. I think when we create memorials to our suffering, even if it's to show and to prove to ourselves how strong we are no longer free, but trapped in the monuments we build. But just feeling it frees us of all these. It allows the emotion, the experience, the pain to run its course. Pain and feelings, in a lot of ways, are like clouds. They can form and be a giant thunderstorm that goes all the way across the Rocky Mountains. Or they can be as simple as a small little cloud on a spring day in a big blue sky that comes and goes. And I want to share, and I want to close, with this teaching from Jack Kornfield. And I really appreciate it. Quote, "How can we be present with difficult situations without indulging our emotions? The problem often lies more in the narratives we tell ourselves and about others that perpetuate suffering. We must be willing to allow the energies of life to rise and fall as they do, while expanding our capacity to feel without necessarily believing the storyline. Our stories are often biased and untrue to begin with. In learning to be with our emotions, we are better able to respond from a place of wisdom rather than an expectation of how it should be." End quote. I think that it's important that we realize the role our stories play. The story I shared about the big breakup um, is just one of those big things, but we suffer all day long. We suffer in our reactivity. We suffer in our defensiveness. We suffer in our anger, in our fear. And all the time we are experiencing these, we are telling stories. And I appreciate this from one Buddhist teacher, quote, our interpretation of events plays a large role in how we experience them, and that we do have a tendency to over dramatize much of what has happened to us. Let's say someone at home or work leaves a pile of dirty dishes on the bench. You notice it and have an immediate reaction, annoyance. So far, so good. First arrow. But what often happens next is we think he or she is always leaving a mess for me to clean up. How many times have I said, blah, 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 they clearly don't care about for me at all. That's why I am always underappreciated. It would have been better not to have been born. End quote. I love that example, but that's the second arrow. That story of why people do things and the motivation of why people do things. You don't know. You barely know your own motivations in your own mind and heart. How could you possibly know another person's mind and heart? And when somebody says, I know you better than you know yourself, tell them to Namo Amida Butsu. My mentor Guillaume Kubose Sensei teaches that we should free ourselves from the tyranny of our expectation of others. I love that. The tyranny of our expectation of others. Here's the reality. I will disappoint you. You will disappoint me. We will disappoint each other. We will abandon each other and be abandoned by each other. That's part of life. That's part of being human. But we can free ourselves of that disappointment by allowing the stories to go away. Life may be disappointing, but we do not have to be disappointed by life, as our Roshi earlier had said in this talk. Others will do hurtful things to you. Other people will disappoint, and you will disappoint other people and hurt other people. That's part of being human. But if we can free ourselves of our tyranny of expectation of others, we will find a grace. We will find come as you are. Because that's the heart of what we do in our fellowship. That is the heart of Namo Amida Butsu, is come as you are. Disappointing or disappointed. Abandoning or abandoned. Fearful or courageous. It doesn't matter. In closing, I am so grateful that you were able to be here today, that you're able to hear the Dharma talk. And I hope that this talk helps you in your everyday life. Because if the teachings of the Buddha cannot be applied to our everyday life, what good are they? May your life be rich, and may you have a Buddhaful day. Namo Amida Butsu.